Welcome back to the AI Driven Marketer. I'm Dan Sanchez. Friends, call me Danchez, and we're on a journey in 2024 to master AI so we can do more with less and better with marketing, right? Because we always have so much to freaking do as marketers. It's a black hole, I've been told. You can always spend more, do more, and have more talent doing marketing stuff. And I'm starting to wonder if AI will ever fill that black hole or if it's possible, right? If we have robots that can do our job for us. And that's kind of the topic that I want to talk about for this solo episode is if AI can replace your brain. The short answer is, I don't think it can yet. But I want to talk about two possibilities where you can use AI to kind of replicate your own brain. Like if you were able to consult a protege, can AI do it for you on your behalf? And the topic of this got started with a post on LinkedIn, and I'm going to pull it up here visually, but I'll be reading it for all the listeners out there. From Andrea Bosoni. Sorry if I mispronounced that. But let me go ahead and read the post, and then I want to talk about my response to the post and how to learn more specifically around custom GPTs and niche LLMs and how both can be used to kind of reproduce yourself for others or for yourself or maybe your direct reports. So let's read the post and then we'll get into it. He says, a random weekend idea I was just discussing with a friend. Let's say I write down most of my marketing knowledge into a few documents, or at least the basic key stuff new founders need to do to set up the foundations right. Then I train an AI model on the specific data. I should get something out of it that's different from a generic ChatGPT answers because it's trained on my exclusive proprietary data. So in theory, the product might be able to give founders basic guidance almost as if they were asking me directly. I wonder if it's easily doable and what the final results would look like in terms of quality. So it's a really good question, and I love that people are thinking about the possibilities that are now possible with AI. Like I said in the very beginning, I don't think this is quite capable yet, but there are two routes to getting this done. Both fall short in a lot of different ways, but have some pros. So let's talk about it. A few weeks ago, I talked about the difference in AI memory, specifically long-term memory, which I have represented here visually as a big circle, and short-term memory, which I have here visually as a very small circle that kind of overlaps with the long-term memory. And in that episode, I talked about how long-term memory is like all the stuff ChatGPT was trained on, or any large language model was trained on. It's the whole internet. It's all the tweets. It's all the books and everything else they threw at it in order to get it to its current level of intelligence. And it knows a lot. But you know, and I know, if you just ask it to write a blog post on product marketing for B2B SaaS, it's going to give you a pretty vanilla post. And it might hallucinate, come up with some weird things in there sometime, because the long-term memory, like our human long-term memory, it's kind of fuzzy, right? We do better when we load up our short-term memory with relevant facts and outline of where we're going and research that we've done ahead of time so that we can pull them into writing an article. AI actually needs the same thing, which is why in that episode I actually broke down, like, in order to make AI perform better, you need to learn at loading its short-term memory with all the stuff that you would want. And things like your prompts are actually loading in short-term memory, or chain prompts, loading in documents, web searches, custom GPT instructions, docs in your custom GPT, or using the custom GPT API in order to feed the short-term memory everything it needs to know, so it can create content or perform the actions that you want more reliably without relying so much on the long-term memory, which causes hallucinations. Because again, the long-term memory is fuzzy, just like in our memory. And I think this becomes an important illustration when considering the two different routes you can use AI to replace your brain and essentially have AI be your chief representation of yourself, either to customers or your team or even yourself, right? There's some pros and cons. So there's two different routes to creating this. One is creating a custom GPT loaded up with all the documents for loading the short-term memory. And I've tried this before, and it works. It's better than just a vanilla chat GPT, right? Like just asking chat GPT, oh, what's Dan Sanchez's thoughts on this? You know, it might be like, I don't know how much of my blog posts were loaded into its long-term memory, but probably not very much. but it'll might take a guess. It might do a Bing search to try to go figure out who Dan Sanchez is and what Dan knows. And it might scrape a few blog posts and then get back to him, but it'll be pretty rough. It's probably not going to know a lot. But if I loaded a custom GPT with maybe like a library of my blog posts and all of my LinkedIn posts and maybe some other strategic frameworks I have for answering questions and dealing with problems, well, it'd probably sound a little bit more like me. And to be honest, I've actually tried this. It was one of the first custom GPTs I made where I wanted to build a life coach, and I armed it with all the information that I had about myself, like life goals, strength finders, blog posts, LinkedIn posts, so I can understand. And I fed it a lot of information, and I found it was pretty hit or miss when I would ask it questions like, hey, based on what you know about me, what should I do? What would be the best way to leverage my strengths for X? And it would give me an answer, and it would do it based on the knowledge. But honestly, I just found that it just wasn't very reliable for problem solving and troubleshooting. So while I tried to make that life coach out of a custom GPT, I found that it just didn't do too well. And honestly, I've had a few different custom GPTs that I've tested where it's like Einstein or whatever, and it's kind of like, it's okay. It's better than just relying on long-term memory because it's at least pulling from some short-term memory stuff, but it still doesn't do quite as well. So that's using a custom GPT to replicate your knowledge and expertise. It is certainly a lot better. The problem with custom GPTs in general is that they're just bad at general purpose stuff. Like where custom GPTs really excel is having highly specialized tasks that they do, and they just do it over and over again. Turning a podcast into a blog post, turning a blog post into multiple LinkedIn posts, or whatever it is that has a task and it has a set step-by-step instructions on how to execute the task within the custom GPT. That's where they excel, and they do fantastic and can produce blog posts that sound like you, they do a great job of sounding like you. I'll put it that way. That's where custom GPTs excel. Now, on the other side, there's this option out there, and I've not done this personally, but I've played around with other people who have other versions of this that other people have created, and it works pretty well. It's called building a niche LLM. And it's taking an existing large language model and then customizing it with a lot of your data and your knowledge so that it's not even loaded into short-term memory. What you're doing is customizing the long-term memory of an LLM like ChatGPT with your proprietary data and knowledge. And so when you don't even have to load the short-term memory, you can be like, hey, write me if it was customized on all the stuff I ever put out there, and it would know about my knowledge and framework for how to grow an audience, for example, which I've created a whole course on. Maybe I load all the course knowledge into it, all the LinkedIn posts, all the blog posts, everything I've ever created around audience growth, and I train it, this LLM on it, and then it becomes Dan Sanchez's audience growth tool or consultant, and you can ask it questions about audience growth. Its ability to take all that knowledge and then give custom information back based on that now long-term memory, because you've now trained it on that, is much better, of course, than a plain vanilla custom GPT. But there's some downsides with it. Because you've trained it into long-term memory, it's still a little fuzzy. It still struggles to break down large projects into small tasks because it's the current limitation. It's the current constraint of AI and where it's at. In the future, it won't have that constraint, and they're already figuring out ways to help it break down and to think slow so that it can actually break down what are fairly complex projects down into small manageable tasks that it can then do really well with. For example, writing a marketing plan or maybe an audience growth plan is one of those ones where you kind of have to break it down into small steps to understand the market that you want to get into, the business model behind why you're creating an audience, the pain points and objectives of the audience, how your expertise can correlate to those things, how you can create content around those things. You see how there's like multiple steps that it can't just think through and solve each one of these. Now, if you created a custom GPT to solve each one of these, it'd do pretty good. But the long-term memory has a hard time thinking through all the different steps you would need to do in order to do it well. Even if it's trained on the way you do it, it will still struggle to do it well, but it will do a much better job of utilizing your method in just one shot in order to get it done. So I'm scrambling a little bit because it's kind of hard to explain how this long-term memory works, but that's what people have done. I've seen two examples of people using niche-trained LLMs. One was Chris Walker, who launched I haven't tested this one, but I've heard good things about it. He loaded all the information from his podcasts and blogs and articles and case studies and data that he had in Refine Labs into his membership area and trained an LLM to essentially act like him. So you could ask the question and it'll give you answers like Chris Walker would give the answers, which is really helpful. But it's still not going to break down a problem like Chris Walker would answer the problem. It's more useful for a Q&A type function, where custom GPTs are great for very specific things. Training a niche LLM to behave more like you based on your data and your frameworks and stuff. It's better for more generic purposes, but it still doesn't know how to apply and think through what should actually be asked. Because I might go to Chris Walker's thing and be like, hey, write me a demand gen marketing plan for a company. Here's a few details about the company. And it'll write a plan, and it'll do it based on Chris Walker's framework for demand gen. But if Chris Walker had been sitting there, Chris Walker would have stopped and been like, hold on a second. Before I write you a plan, here's 5 questions of information I need before I write the plan, right? That's different than how Chris Walker would operate, even though it's much more closely aligned with Chris Walker's principles. Another example I saw of this was Dave Ramsey. I have a lot of friends that work there because I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and that's where his company is located. So I have a lot of friends that work at Ramsey Solutions, and they have a Dave bot. It's not publicly available. It's just a little internal thing because they're testing and playing with AI and just, I don't know, they're smart and they're staying on top of it internally for the day when it becomes more reliable to do something with it externally. So you can't test this, but I've seen it because my friends have been over and I've tested DaveBot against just asking ChatGPT base to give me Dave Ramsey answers to financial questions, since he's a big finance guru out there. I've asked questions and I've asked the DaveBot questions, or at least my friend has on their phone where they can tap into it. And the DaveBot is much better at answering in a way that I know Dave Ramsey would answer. Let's put it that way. It's much more reliable. Is it 100% reliable? No, because it can still hallucinate. You're still pulling from long-term memory in order to do it. So because they're a trust-based brand, they don't want to release something that they don't have a very, very strong degree of confidence that it's going to be reliable like 99.999% of the time, right? But that is the advantage of loading a custom niche LLM with all your knowledge and then training it and giving it time to process it all for people to interact with. It's great for Q&A, but it's still not the same as replicating yourself. It's still not the same as identifying the question behind the question that needs to be asked, or asking someone who you're consulting that might be going in a direction. They think they need to go to this direction. You're like, actually, based on what you're saying, you don't want to go in this direction. You need to go in this opposite direction, or a slight deviated road you need to take, right? And that's the power of a consultant. That's the power of someone who has the experience and the knowledge to be able to guide a business. In the case of the LinkedIn post we were reading later, it's still good for Q&A though. I find if you want to have direct answers for certain questions, loading the long-term memory is helpful because it'll have much more reliable answers. So can you replicate your brain? Not yet. But you can build a custom GPT that follows step-by-step processes based on your frameworks and knowledge to execute very specific results. And you can load long-term memory with all your knowledge so that it can give general Q&A style answers. But it still can't replicate your ability to identify the actual problem and solve for it, regardless of if they ask the right question or not. That's still the very human thing that we all can do, luckily. But AI is still working its way there, and eventually I imagine I will do an update episode where I talk about how to replicate your brain on AI, and that'll be fun. But for now, these are the limitations we have and can still do some amazing things with where AI is currently at. So if you've liked this episode, please give it the star rating it deserves in the Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you're listening to podcasts. If you're listening on YouTube, please give me a thumbs up. It makes it all the work worthwhile, or give me a comment or something. And if you want to dive more into AI, please go find my AI Fundamentals course. I promise you will learn something you haven't known before about AI. Go to aidrivenmarketer.com/course And you'll even be surprised by how I've designed the course with hyper-personalized course instructions based on the information you put in the form. So if for anything, go check it out for that reason and get started today.